There are places in Illinois that don't show up on any map of tourist spots, and locals don't avoid them because of superstition, they avoid them because something really happened there. 1 Bachelor's Grove Cemetery. I had heard stories about Bachelor's Grove Cemetery for years before I finally decided to visit it. Most people in the area knew the place by name. Some laughed when the stories came up. Others became strangely quiet. That alone made me curious. It was late in the afternoon when I arrived. The cemetery sat deep inside a wooded area, far away from busy roads and city noise. The moment I stepped onto the trail leading toward it, everything felt different. The air seemed heavier. Even the sounds of birds became less frequent. At first, nothing seemed unusual. It looked like an old cemetery that had simply been forgotten by time. Many of the graves were damaged. Some markers were difficult to read. Trees and weeds had slowly taken over parts of the area. It felt abandoned, but not empty. As I walked deeper inside, I noticed something that bothered me. The place was completely silent. Not normal silence. The kind of silence that makes you aware of every step you take. I remember checking my phone for the time. It was working normally. A few minutes later, I looked again. For some reason, I had only moved a short distance, yet much more time seemed to have passed than I expected. I told myself I was probably distracted. I continued walking. Near the center of the cemetery, I stopped beside one of the older graves. The wind suddenly picked up and moved through the trees. It wasn't strong, but it felt cold compared to the temperature outside the woods. That was when I heard it. A sound behind me. Not a voice. Not exactly footsteps. Just enough noise to make me turn around immediately. Nobody was there. I stood still for several seconds, staring into the trees. The feeling of being watched appeared almost instantly. It wasn't something I could prove. It was simply a feeling that refused to go away. I tried to ignore it and continued exploring. A few minutes later, I took several photos around the cemetery. I wanted pictures of the graves and the surrounding landscape before leaving. Nothing unusual appeared on my screen at the time. The strange part happened later that night. After returning home, I looked through the images on my computer. Most were normal. Then one photograph caught my attention. Near the edge of the frame, between several trees, there appeared to be a pale shape. It was difficult to identify. Maybe it was light reflecting through branches. Maybe it was something else. The longer I looked at it, the less certain I became. I sent the image to a friend without telling him what I noticed. His reply came back a few minutes later. "Who is standing near the trees?" That message gave me chills. To this day, I cannot say I saw a ghost. I cannot prove anything supernatural happened at Bachelor's Grove Cemetery. But I can say this, I have visited many abandoned places, old buildings, and historic locations. Very few stayed in my mind afterward. Bachelor's Grove did. Even now, years later, I still remember the silence, the feeling of being watched, and that photograph. Maybe there is a simple explanation for everything that happened. Or maybe some places hold on to their stories longer than others. 2 Congress Plaza Hotel. I checked into the Congress Plaza Hotel expecting nothing more than an old historic building. I had heard people call it one of the most haunted hotels in Chicago, but honestly, I thought most of those stories were exaggerated. Every old hotel seems to have ghost stories attached to it. That confidence lasted about 2 hours. The building itself felt different the moment I entered. The lobby was beautiful, but there was something about it that felt frozen in time. As if decades had passed outside while the inside remained exactly the same. I checked in during the evening and took the elevator to my floor. The hallway was unusually quiet. Not the normal quiet you find in hotels. It felt empty. I remember looking down the long corridor and thinking how strange it was that I couldn't hear a single television, conversation, or door closing. My room looked normal enough. I dropped my bag near the bed, looked out the window toward the city lights, and spent the next few hours exploring downtown Chicago. When I returned later that night, the hallway felt even stranger. The lights seemed dimmer. The silence felt heavier. As I walked toward my room, I noticed a door at the far end of the corridor slowly closing. I assumed another guest had just entered their room. But when I reached my door and looked back, I realized something odd. There were no rooms where I thought I had seen the door move. I stood there for several seconds trying to understand what I had seen. Eventually I laughed it off and went inside. Around 2 a.m., I woke up unexpectedly. No sound had woken me. No nightmare. I was simply awake. At first I stayed in bed staring at the ceiling. Then I heard it. A faint sound coming from the hallway. It sounded like footsteps. Slow footsteps. One step. Then another. Then another. The strange thing was that they never seemed to get closer or farther away. They remained at the exact same distance. I sat up and listened carefully. The sound continued for almost a minute before suddenly stopping. The silence that followed felt worse. I waited. Nothing. Eventually curiosity got the better of me. I opened the door and looked into the hallway. Nobody was there. The corridor stretched in both directions completely empty. I walked a few feet outside my room. Still nothing. No voices. No movement. No sign that anyone had been there. The next morning I convinced myself there had to be a simple explanation. Maybe another guest. Maybe old plumbing. Maybe the building settling. The problem was that the strange feeling never left. Later that day, while speaking with an employee, I casually mentioned hearing footsteps during the night. I wasn't expecting much of a response. Instead, he smiled. Not a surprised smile. The kind of smile someone gives after hearing a familiar story. He simply said, "You're not the first person to mention that." That answer stayed with me. I spent another night at the hotel. Nothing dramatic happened. No ghost appeared. No objects moved. Yet I slept worse than I had in years. Every sound made me open my eyes. Every shadow seemed darker than it should have been. When I finally checked out, I felt relieved to leave. Even now, whenever someone asks me about the Congress Plaza Hotel, I tell them the same thing. I cannot prove anything paranormal happened there. I never saw a ghost. But I also cannot explain the footsteps, the empty hallway, or the feeling that someone was standing just outside my room long after the corridor had gone silent. And that feeling followed me all the way home. 3 Old Joliet Prison. I had visited abandoned places before, but nothing prepared me for the feeling of standing in front of Old Joliet Prison for the first time. Even from outside, the massive stone walls looked intimidating. The prison had been closed for years, yet it still felt like a place that wanted to keep people inside. The sky was gray that afternoon, and a cold wind moved through the empty grounds. As I walked toward the entrance, I couldn't stop thinking about the thousands of inmates who had once lived behind those walls. Some had spent decades there. Some never made it back out. At first, I was excited. I had always been interested in historic locations, and this place had more history than almost anywhere else I had visited. But the deeper I went into the prison, the more that excitement changed into something else. The cell blocks were the first thing that caught my attention. Long rows of steel bars stretched in both directions. Every cell looked nearly identical. Standing there, I tried to imagine what life must have felt like for the prisoners. The thought alone was unsettling. As I walked through one of the corridors, I noticed how strangely sound behaved inside the building. Small noises echoed for much longer than they should have. Every footstep bounced off the walls and returned seconds later. At least, that's what I thought at first. Then something happened. I stopped walking to take a photo. A second later, I heard another footstep. The problem was that I hadn't moved. I immediately turned around. Nobody was there. The corridor behind me was completely empty. I stood still, listening carefully. Nothing. For a moment I convinced myself it had simply been an echo from my own movement. It seemed like the logical explanation. So I continued deeper into the prison. The farther I went, the darker the building became. Some areas received almost no natural light. The atmosphere felt heavier with every room I entered. Eventually I reached an older section that looked far more deteriorated than the rest. Broken walls. Rusting metal. Peeling paint. Everything about it felt forgotten. As I explored that section, I became aware of something I hadn't noticed before. The prison was completely silent. Not normal silence. The kind that makes you suddenly aware of your own breathing. I remember stopping near one of the cells and looking through the bars. That's when I felt it. A sudden chill. Not throughout the room. Just around me. It lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough to make me step back. I checked the surrounding area expecting to find an open window or a draft. There was nothing. The air returned to normal almost immediately. At that point I decided it was probably time to leave. I wasn't scared exactly. Just uncomfortable. As I headed back toward the main entrance, I passed through one final corridor. Halfway through, I heard what sounded like metal striking metal. A sharp clanging sound. It echoed through the prison. Loud enough that I froze instantly. I waited for another sound. Nothing came. The building returned to silence. When I finally reached the exit and stepped outside, the feeling of tension disappeared almost immediately. The difference was so noticeable that I actually stopped and looked back at the prison. To this day, I cannot say I experienced anything supernatural inside Old Joliet prison. Every strange moment might have a reasonable explanation. Old buildings make noises. Temperature changes happen. Echoes can be misleading. But I can also say this. I have explored many historic places since then. Most became distant memories. Old Joliet prison didn't. Years later, I still remember every corridor, every sound, and the strange feeling that I was never truly alone inside those walls. For Resurrection Cemetery. I first heard about Resurrection Cemetery from a taxi driver while visiting the Chicago area. We were talking about old buildings and local history when he suddenly asked me if I had ever heard of Resurrection Mary. I hadn't. The moment he mentioned the name, his expression changed. He wasn't trying to scare me. In fact, he spoke so casually that it made the story feel even more believable. According to him, people had been reporting sightings of a young woman near Resurrection Cemetery for decades. Drivers claimed they had seen her walking along the road late at night. Some even said they offered her a ride, only for her to disappear before reaching her destination. I love local legends, but I usually approach them with skepticism. Still, a few nights later, curiosity got the better of me. Just before midnight, I drove toward Resurrection Cemetery. The roads were mostly empty. Streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement, and the farther I drove from the city, the quieter everything became. When I finally reached the cemetery, I pulled over across the road. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Rows of graves stretched into the darkness behind the fence. The entrance gates stood silent beneath the dim light. I sat there for several minutes, watching. Nothing happened. Part of me felt relieved. Another part felt disappointed. I had almost decided to leave when I noticed movement near the sidewalk. At first, I assumed it was another visitor. But the figure wasn't moving the way I expected. She appeared to be walking slowly along the edge of the road. A young woman. Light-colored clothing. Long hair. I couldn't make out many details from that distance, but she definitely looked real. For a moment, I simply watched. Then I started my car and slowly drove closer. The closer I got, the stranger the situation felt. It was nearly midnight. The road was quiet. Yet she seemed completely unconcerned about being alone. When my headlights reached her position, she turned slightly. I expected her face to become clearer. Instead, I found myself struggling to focus on her features. It felt odd. Almost like looking through fog. I slowed down further. For a second, I considered rolling down the window and asking if she needed help. Then another car approached from the opposite direction. Its headlights briefly crossed the road between us. Only a second passed. Maybe two. But when the lights moved away, the woman was gone. Completely gone. There was nowhere she could have walked in that amount of time. No nearby building. No parked vehicle. Nothing. I immediately pulled over. My heart was racing now. I got out and looked around. The road was empty. The sidewalk was empty. The cemetery entrance stood exactly where it had been moments earlier. Silent. Still. I spent the next 10 minutes searching the area. I found nobody. Eventually, I returned to my car. The logical side of my brain tried to explain everything. Maybe it had been a trick of the light. Maybe someone had crossed the road without me noticing. Maybe my eyes had misjudged the distance. All of those explanations sounded reasonable. Yet none of them felt completely satisfying. As I drove away, I glanced into the rearview mirror one final time. The cemetery was disappearing into the darkness behind me. Even today, I cannot honestly say I saw a ghost. I never heard a voice. I never witnessed anything impossible. But I also can't explain why a woman standing clearly beside the road seemed to vanish in the brief moment another car's headlights passed between us. Years later, that question still stays with me. And every time I hear someone mention Resurrection Mary, I immediately think back to that empty road and the figure that should have still been there. 5 Hickory Hill, Old Slave House. I wasn't planning to visit Hickory Hill that day. The trip started as a normal drive through rural Illinois. I had been exploring historic places for several days, and someone I met at a small diner mentioned an old house with a dark reputation. He called it the Old Slave House. The way he said those words immediately caught my attention. He didn't smile when he said it. He didn't try to make it sound scary. Instead, he became unusually serious and simply said, "The history there feels different." A few hours later, I found myself standing in front of Hickory Hill. At first glance, it looked like many other old historic buildings I had visited. The structure was aging. The wood showed signs of time. The surrounding area was quiet. Yet something about the place felt uncomfortable before I even stepped inside. Maybe it was the stories I had already heard. Maybe it was the history. Either way, I couldn't shake the feeling. As I entered the house, I immediately noticed how narrow some sections felt. The rooms weren't particularly large, and the hallways seemed strangely confined. The air inside felt cooler than outside. Not dramatically colder. Just enough to notice. A guide shared details about the property's past and the various claims that had surrounded it over the years. Most of the information focused on history, and I listened carefully. The more I learned, the heavier the atmosphere seemed to become. At one point, we reached a section of the house that many visitors considered the most unsettling. I remember standing there quietly while everyone else moved ahead. For a moment, I found myself completely alone. That's when I heard it. A soft sound behind me. Almost like a floorboard shifting under someone's weight. I turned immediately. Nobody was there. The hallway behind me was empty. I assumed another visitor had been walking nearby. It seemed like the obvious explanation. But when I caught up with the group, I realized everyone had already moved much farther ahead than I expected. Nobody could have been standing where I had heard the noise. The realization made me uneasy. I tried not to think about it. As the tour continued, I focused on taking photographs and studying the architecture. Everything felt normal again. Then something happened that stayed with me long after I left. While examining one of the rooms, I became aware of a strange sensation. It felt as though someone was standing directly beside me. Not touching me. Not speaking. Just standing there. The feeling was so strong that I instinctively stepped to one side. I even looked around expecting to find another visitor. There wasn't anyone close to me. The room was nearly empty. Yet the sensation remained for several seconds before slowly fading. At that point, I wanted fresh air. The history of the house was already difficult to process, and my imagination was probably working overtime. At least that's what I told myself. When I finally stepped outside, I felt immediate relief. The tension I had been carrying seemed to disappear almost instantly. I sat in my car for several minutes before leaving. As I looked back toward the building, I tried to decide whether anything unusual had actually happened. Every experience had a possible explanation. Old houses make noises. Historic places can affect emotions. A powerful history can influence the way people feel. I understand all of that. But years later, Hickory Hill remains one of the few places I still think about. Not because I saw a ghost. Not because I witnessed anything impossible. But because for a few brief moments inside that house, I felt something I have never been able to fully explain. And sometimes, the things you can't explain stay with you longer than the things you can. 6. Manteno State Hospital. I first heard about Manteno State Hospital from a local historian during a road trip through Illinois. We were discussing abandoned places when he mentioned a massive psychiatric hospital that once housed thousands of patients. The moment he described it, I knew I wanted to see it for myself. A few days later, I drove to Manteno. The area looked normal enough. Families lived nearby. Cars passed on the roads. Nothing about the town felt unusual. But the closer I got to the old hospital grounds, the more the atmosphere seemed to change. The remaining buildings stood as reminders of a place that had once been filled with people. Thousands of people. Patients. Doctors. Nurses. Workers. Many of them spent years there. Some spent most of their lives there. Standing near the property, I couldn't stop thinking about all those stories that had begun and ended behind those walls. At first, I felt curious. Then I started feeling uneasy. Not because of ghost stories. Because of the history. Places connected to suffering often carry a different kind of weight. Even when they're empty. I spent the afternoon walking around the area and taking photographs. Most of the time nothing unusual happened. The buildings were silent. The grounds were quiet. Everything seemed exactly as expected. Then I noticed something strange. No matter where I walked, I kept feeling as though someone was watching me from one of the upper windows. Every few minutes, I found myself looking back toward the same building. Each time the windows were empty. Still, the feeling refused to disappear. I laughed at myself and blamed it on the stories I had heard. But deep down, I wasn't completely convinced. As the afternoon turned into evening, the sky began to darken. The property suddenly looked very different. The empty windows no longer appeared abandoned. Instead, they looked like dark openings staring back at me. That's when I decided to take a few final photographs before leaving. I stood facing one of the old structures and began taking pictures. One photo. Then another. Then another. Nothing seemed unusual. At least not at the time. A few minutes later, I sat inside my car and started reviewing the images. Most looked normal. Then I reached one photograph that made me stop scrolling. In one of the upper windows, there appeared to be a shape. Not a clear figure. Not enough detail to identify anything. Just something darker than the surrounding shadows. I zoomed in. The image became blurry. I zoomed in further. Still nothing definite. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been standing there, watching. The logical explanation was obvious. Old buildings create strange shadows. Broken windows reflect light in unusual ways. Photography often captures things that look different from reality. I knew all of that. But the timing bothered me. The shape appeared in the exact building that had been drawing my attention all afternoon. The same building I kept looking toward without knowing why. I sat there for several minutes staring at the photograph. The longer I looked, the less certain I became. Eventually I put my phone away and started driving home. I expected the feeling to disappear once I left. Instead, I kept thinking about the place for days. Not because I believed I had captured evidence of something paranormal, but because I couldn't explain why that building had held my attention from the moment I arrived. Years have passed since that visit. I've explored many abandoned hospitals, prisons, and historic sites since then. Most faded from memory. Manteno State Hospital didn't. Even now, when I look back at that photograph, I still remember the strange silence, the empty windows, and the uncomfortable feeling that somewhere inside those forgotten buildings, something was quietly watching me long before I noticed it. 7 Cahokia Mounds. I arrived at Cahokia Mounds on a cool autumn afternoon expecting to learn about history. What I didn't expect was how strangely emotional the place would feel. From photographs, the site had always looked simple. Just large grassy mounds rising from the ground. But standing there in person felt completely different. The scale of the place surprised me immediately. Hundreds of years ago, this area had been one of the largest cities in North America. Thousands of people had lived there long before modern cities existed nearby. That thought stayed in my mind as I began walking through the site. At first everything felt peaceful. The sky was clear. The grass moved gently in the wind. Visitors quietly explored the area. Nothing about the place seemed frightening. In fact, it felt almost calming. I spent over an hour walking between the mounds, reading historical information, and imagining what life must have been like centuries ago. The deeper I thought about the history, the more fascinating the place became. But as the afternoon slowly turned toward evening, something changed. The crowds began to disappear. The sounds of conversation faded. The open landscape suddenly felt much larger than before. And much emptier. I remember climbing one of the higher observation areas and looking across the site. The view stretched for what seemed like miles. Grass. Trees. Mounds. Silence. For a moment, I felt completely alone. That's when I experienced something strange. Not something dramatic. Just a feeling. A very strong feeling. As I stood there looking across the landscape, I became aware of how many lives had once existed in that exact location. Thousands of people. Families. Children. Leaders. Workers. Entire generations had lived and died there. The realization hit me harder than I expected. The place no longer felt empty. It felt occupied by history. I know that sounds strange, but it's the only way I can describe it. As the sun moved lower, long shadows stretched across the ground. The atmosphere became noticeably different. The peaceful feeling from earlier had been replaced by something heavier. I continued walking toward my car, taking a final series of photographs along the way. At one point, I stopped near a mound and looked back across the field. For a brief moment, I thought I saw movement near the horizon. A figure. Standing still. Too far away to identify. I blinked. Looked again. Nothing. The area appeared completely empty. I told myself it had probably been another visitor. That explanation made perfect sense. Yet I couldn't stop looking in that direction. The feeling lingered. As if someone had been standing there just seconds earlier. Eventually I continued walking. The closer I got to the parking area, the more normal everything felt again. Cars. Voices. Modern life. The strange atmosphere slowly faded. But later that evening, while reviewing photographs from the trip, I found myself staring at the images much longer than expected. There was nothing unusual in them. No mysterious figures. No unexplained shadows. Nothing paranormal. Yet every photograph seemed to capture the same feeling I had experienced while standing there. A feeling that the land remembered far more than it revealed. To this day, I don't tell people that Cahokia Mounds is haunted. I can't honestly say that. What I can say is that it is one of the few places I have ever visited where history felt almost alive. Not in a supernatural way. In a human way. A place where the past never seems completely gone. And as the sun disappeared behind those ancient mounds, I left with the uncomfortable feeling that I had been walking through far more than an archaeological site. I had been walking through the memory of an entire lost world. 8 McPike Mansion. I had visited plenty of old houses before, so when I arrived at McPike Mansion, I expected another interesting piece of history. Nothing more. The mansion stood on a hill overlooking part of Alton. Even from a distance, the building immediately caught my attention. Time had left its mark everywhere. The walls looked tired. The windows seemed dark even during daylight. Yet despite its condition, the mansion still had a strange beauty. The kind that makes you stop and stare. I arrived in the late afternoon and spent some time walking around the property. The history of the place fascinated me. Every room seemed connected to another story, another family memory, another forgotten chapter of the past. At first, I felt completely comfortable. The house was old. Nothing unusual about that. But the longer I stayed, the more I noticed something strange. The atmosphere inside felt different from room to room. One area felt normal. The next felt oddly uncomfortable. Then another felt completely fine again. It wasn't something I could explain. I simply noticed it. As the tour continued, our guide shared stories visitors had reported over the years. Unusual sounds. Strange shadows. Unexplained photographs. I listened politely but remained skeptical. Old buildings often create strange experiences. History has a way of affecting people's imagination. That seemed like the most reasonable explanation. Then evening arrived. The sunlight faded quickly through the windows, and the mansion began to look completely different. Shadows filled the corners of every room. Hallways seemed longer. The silence felt heavier. At one point, I found myself standing alone near a staircase while the rest of the group moved ahead. I remember checking my phone. Then I heard it. A single footstep. Directly above me. Not a creak. Not settling wood. A footstep. Slow. Heavy. Clear. I looked toward the upper floor immediately. Nothing moved. Nobody appeared. For several seconds, I simply stood there listening. The house remained silent. Eventually I convinced myself there had to be another explanation. Perhaps someone from the tour group had remained upstairs. That seemed logical enough. But when I caught up with everyone else, I realized something unsettling. Every member of the group had already gathered in a completely different section of the mansion. No one had been above me. The realization stayed in my mind for the rest of the evening. I tried not to focus on it. Then something happened that bothered me even more. Near the end of the visit, I decided to take a final photograph inside one of the rooms. The room looked empty. I checked carefully before taking the picture. Nobody was standing near me. Nobody entered while I was there. The photograph seemed normal at first. Later that night, I reviewed it on my laptop. That's when I noticed a shape near the doorway. Not a clear person. Not enough detail to identify anyone. Just a dark figure-like outline where there should have been empty space. I zoomed in repeatedly. The image only became more confusing. The shape remained visible but impossible to identify. For several minutes I stared at the screen. The logical side of my brain offered plenty of explanations. Lighting. Shadows. Camera artifacts. All perfectly reasonable. Yet something about the image bothered me. Not because it proved anything. Because it matched the feeling I had experienced inside the mansion. That same feeling that someone else had been there. Watching quietly from another room. To this day, I cannot honestly claim I encountered a ghost at McPike Mansion. I never saw a spirit. I never witnessed anything impossible. But years later, I still remember that footstep above me. I still remember the photograph. And most of all, I remember leaving the property with the strange sensation that the mansion wasn't truly abandoned. The building was empty. Yet somehow, it never felt alone. 9 Mineral Springs Hotel. I arrived at the Mineral Springs Hotel just before sunset. I had heard about the building for years. Most people talked about its history first and its ghost stories second. That was one of the reasons I wanted to visit. Places with real history always interested me more than places that relied only on scary rumors. From the outside, the building looked impressive. Old brick walls. Tall windows. A design that clearly belonged to another era. As I stood across the street looking at it, I found myself wondering how many people had walked through those doors over the decades. Thousands, probably. Maybe more. That thought stayed with me as I entered the building. The atmosphere inside was difficult to describe. It didn't feel threatening. It felt old. Very old. The hallways carried a kind of silence that modern buildings rarely have. Every sound seemed to linger a little longer. Every step echoed. At first, I enjoyed exploring. The history fascinated me. Stories of visitors. Stories of workers. Stories connected to the famous mineral springs that had once attracted people from all over the country. Everything felt completely normal. Then I entered one of the upper hallways. The change was immediate. I can't explain why. Nothing looked different. Nothing appeared unusual. Yet the moment I stepped into that corridor, I felt uncomfortable. Not scared. Just uneasy. I continued walking anyway. The hallway stretched ahead of me, lined with old doors. Most were closed. Some appeared unused. As I moved farther down the corridor, I became aware of a strange sound. At first, I thought it was coming from outside. A faint tapping noise. Slow. Irregular. Almost like someone lightly touching a wall. I stopped walking. The sound stopped too. I waited. Nothing. After several seconds, I continued forward. The tapping returned. 3 taps. Pause. 2 taps. Silence. I looked around trying to locate the source. There was nobody nearby. The hallway remained completely empty. Eventually the sound stopped again. This time it didn't return. I told myself it was probably an old pipe or part of the building settling. That explanation made sense. At least it should have. Later that evening, I spent time speaking with several people familiar with the hotel. Most of the conversation focused on history. Then someone casually mentioned hearing unexplained sounds in certain parts of the building. The comment immediately caught my attention. I didn't mention my experience. Instead, I simply listened. The more they talked, the more I found myself thinking about the hallway. About the tapping. About the strange feeling I couldn't explain. Hours later, before leaving, I decided to walk through the corridor one final time. I wanted to prove to myself that nothing unusual had happened. The hallway looked exactly the same. The doors remained closed. The air felt still. For a few moments, everything seemed perfectly normal. Then I noticed something. One of the doors farther down the corridor appeared slightly open. I was almost certain it had been closed earlier. Maybe I was mistaken. Maybe someone had entered. Either explanation was reasonable. Yet I couldn't stop staring at it. The door wasn't moving. Nothing stood behind it. Still, the sight bothered me enough that I chose not to walk any farther. Instead, I turned around and headed back toward the main area. The strange feeling disappeared almost immediately. By the time I left the building, I felt normal again. Even now, I don't claim that anything paranormal happened inside the Mineral Springs Hotel. Every experience has a possible explanation. Old buildings make noises. Doors shift. Sounds travel in unexpected ways. I understand that. But whenever someone asks me about the hotel, I always remember that hallway. The tapping. The silence. The partially open door. And the uncomfortable feeling that for a brief moment, the building seemed aware that I was there. 10 Old Alton Bridge. I reached Old Alton Bridge much later than I had planned. The sun had already disappeared behind the trees, and the last bit of daylight was fading fast. Looking back now, I probably should have come earlier. The bridge had a reputation long before I arrived, and almost everyone I spoke to in Alton had something to say about it. Some laughed about the stories. Others refused to talk about the place at all. That alone made me curious. The bridge itself wasn't particularly large, but it felt isolated. Dense trees surrounded the area, and once I stepped onto the trail leading toward it, the sounds of the nearby town seemed to disappear completely. I remember checking my phone for signal. It was weak. Not gone, but weak enough to be annoying. At the time, I didn't think much about it. As I approached the bridge, the atmosphere became strangely quiet. No traffic. No voices. Just the occasional sound of wind moving through the trees. For a few minutes, I simply stood there looking at the structure. It felt older than it looked in photographs. Older and somehow heavier. I crossed slowly, taking pictures along the way. Everything seemed normal. Then I noticed something strange. On the opposite side of the bridge, I thought I saw someone standing near the tree line. At first, I assumed it was another visitor. That wouldn't have been unusual. The figure appeared motionless. Just standing there. Watching. I raised my camera, planning to zoom in. The moment I looked through the screen, the area appeared empty. I lowered the camera. The figure seemed to be there again. I blinked several times. Looked carefully. Nothing. The tree line stood completely still. I laughed at myself and blamed the fading light. It was the only explanation that made sense. Still, the experience left me slightly uneasy. I continued exploring for another 20 minutes. As darkness settled in, the woods became much harder to see through. The shadows seemed deeper. The trail looked different. Even familiar landmarks became difficult to recognize. That's when I heard the first sound. A branch snapping somewhere behind me. I turned immediately. Nothing. The trail remained empty. I waited. The silence returned. Again, I tried to explain it logically. Wildlife. A falling branch. Any number of normal reasons. I started walking back toward the bridge. A few minutes later, I heard another sound. This time it was closer. Not loud. Just enough to make me stop. For several seconds, I listened carefully. Then came something that bothered me more than the sound itself. The feeling. That unmistakable feeling that someone was standing nearby. Not visible. Not speaking. Just there. Watching. I've experienced that sensation before in unfamiliar places, but this felt unusually strong. I found myself walking faster. Not running. Just moving with purpose. The bridge finally came into view again. The moment I stepped onto it, I felt slightly relieved. Then I heard a faint metallic noise somewhere behind me. A quick clank. Like metal striking metal. I spun around. The bridge was empty. The trail behind me was empty. Everything appeared exactly as it should. Yet my heart was racing. I didn't stop again. I crossed the bridge, reached my car, and locked the door before taking a breath. As I sat there, I looked back toward the woods. The darkness had completely swallowed the trail. Whatever had caused those sounds was no longer visible. Maybe there was a simple explanation. There usually is. Wild animals. Wind. My imagination responding to local legends. All of those possibilities are reasonable. Even today, I cannot say I experienced anything supernatural at Old Alton Bridge. But I can say this. Of all the places I've explored, very few made me feel as though I wasn't alone. And even now, years later, when I think about that bridge, I still remember the empty trail, the strange sounds in the darkness, and the uncomfortable feeling that something had been following me all the way back to my car. 11 Peoria State Hospital. I didn't plan to stay at the old grounds of Peoria State Hospital until sunset. The original idea was simple. Arrive early. Take photographs. Learn some history. Leave before dark. That was the plan. But the place had a way of pulling my attention deeper than I expected. The first thing I noticed was how ordinary everything looked from a distance. Trees surrounded much of the area. Birds moved between branches. The wind carried the usual sounds of nature. Nothing felt haunted. Nothing felt frightening. In fact, if someone had brought me there without telling me its history, I probably would have treated it like any other historic site. That changed once I started learning about the people who had lived there. Thousands of patients had passed through the institution over the years. Doctors. Nurses. Families. Entire lives connected to a place that most people had forgotten. The more I read, the quieter I became. History has a strange way of changing how a location feels. And by late afternoon, the grounds no longer seemed ordinary. They felt heavy. Not physically. Emotionally. I continued walking while taking photographs of the remaining structures and surrounding landscape. Everything remained normal. Then something happened that immediately caught my attention. I heard what sounded like a distant voice. Not words. Just a voice. Soft. Brief. Almost carried by the wind. I stopped walking and listened carefully. Nothing. The sound vanished as quickly as it had appeared. I waited for several seconds. Still nothing. The logical explanation seemed obvious. Someone nearby. A visitor. A person speaking somewhere beyond the trees. That made perfect sense. So I continued walking. A few minutes later, the same thing happened again. This time I was standing completely still. The sound came from somewhere ahead of me. Again, I couldn't make out words. Just the faint impression of a human voice. I immediately looked around. The area appeared empty. No visitors. No movement. Only trees. The silence that followed felt unusually deep. For the first time that day, I felt genuinely uncomfortable. Not scared. Just unsettled. As evening approached, long shadows stretched across the ground. The atmosphere shifted noticeably. Places connected to difficult histories often feel different after dark. At least that's how it seemed to me. I decided to take a final series of photographs before leaving. While reviewing them on my camera, I noticed something strange. One image appeared darker than the others. Not dramatically darker. Just enough to stand out. At first I assumed the camera settings had changed. But the more I examined it, the more unusual it seemed. The photograph had been taken in the same area where I thought I heard the voice. For a moment, I simply stared at it, looking for an explanation, searching for some detail I had missed. Eventually I found nothing unusual. No figure. No shadow. Nothing that shouldn't have been there. Yet the image still bothered me. It carried the same feeling I had experienced while standing there. A feeling that I wasn't completely alone. By the time I returned to my car, darkness had settled across the area. The relief was immediate. The strange tension disappeared almost as soon as I left. The drive home gave me plenty of time to think. Maybe the voices had been distant visitors. Maybe the photograph looked different because of changing light conditions. Maybe every strange moment had a simple explanation. Most likely, they did. Even now, years later, I don't tell people that I encountered a ghost at Peoria State Hospital. That wouldn't be true. What I tell them instead is this. Some places leave an impression that stays with you long after you've gone. Not because of what you saw, but because of what you felt. And of all the historic locations I've explored, Peoria State Hospital remains one of the few that still makes me pause whenever I think about it. 12 Devil's Backbone. I arrived at Devil's Backbone later than I should have. The plan had been simple. Hike the trail, take some photographs, enjoy the view, and head back before dark. But like many trips that start with a good plan, things didn't go exactly as expected. The first thing that struck me was the landscape. The cliffs were far more impressive in person than they appeared in pictures. The Mississippi River stretched into the distance, and the view from certain points was incredible. For the first hour, everything felt normal. The weather was good. The trail was quiet. A few hikers passed by occasionally. Nothing unusual happened. In fact, I remember thinking that the location didn't feel scary at all. If anything, it felt peaceful. That changed when I decided to explore a less traveled section of the trail. The farther I walked, the fewer people I saw. Soon I wasn't seeing anyone at all. The only sounds were the wind moving through the trees and the occasional crunch of leaves beneath my boots. I didn't mind the isolation. I've always enjoyed quiet places. But after a while, the silence became noticeable. Then it became uncomfortable. At one point I stopped to take photographs near a rocky overlook. As I stood there adjusting my camera settings, I heard what sounded like footsteps behind me. Slow footsteps. Deliberate. Close enough that I immediately assumed another hiker had arrived. Without thinking, I stepped aside to make room on the narrow trail. Then I turned around. Nobody was there. The trail behind me was empty. I stared for several seconds. Nothing moved. No voices. No sign of another person. The experience unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. Still, I found a reasonable explanation. The terrain was uneven. The wind was strong. Maybe rocks had shifted somewhere nearby. That seemed logical. So I continued walking. As the afternoon wore on, clouds began moving across the sky. The shadows grew longer. The trail looked different than it had earlier. Less welcoming. More isolated. That's when I noticed something strange. No matter which direction I looked, I felt as if someone was standing just beyond my field of vision. Every time I turned, the feeling disappeared. Then it returned moments later. I told myself it was imagination. The combination of solitude and local legends can affect anyone. Yet the feeling refused to go away. Eventually I decided it was time to head back. The problem was that I suddenly wasn't as confident about the route as I had been earlier. The trail seemed unfamiliar. Landmarks I remembered looked different in the fading light. For the first time all day, I felt genuinely nervous. Nothing dangerous had happened. I simply felt out of place. As though I had wandered somewhere I wasn't supposed to be. Then came the moment I still think about years later. While rounding a bend in the trail, I caught sight of a figure standing farther ahead. Just for a second. A dark silhouette near the trees. I froze. The figure didn't move. Neither did I. Then I blinked. And it was gone. Completely gone. I immediately walked forward to investigate. The area was empty. No person. No side trail. Nothing. The experience stayed with me for the rest of the hike. When I finally reached the parking area, I felt a wave of relief. The normal sounds of civilization returned. Cars. Voices. Movement. Everything suddenly felt familiar again. Even today, I can't say that anything supernatural happened at Devil's Backbone. Maybe the footsteps had a natural cause. Maybe the silhouette was a trick of light and shadow. Maybe every strange moment had a perfectly reasonable explanation. But what I remember most isn't what I saw. It's what I felt. The overwhelming sense that something was quietly watching from the edge of the trail the entire time. And no matter how many explanations I consider, that feeling has never completely left me. 13 Bloods Point Cemetery. I first heard about Bloods Point Cemetery from a local resident while traveling through Boone County. The conversation started normally. We were talking about old roads, abandoned places, and forgotten history. Then he mentioned a cemetery that locals had been talking about for generations. Bloods Point Cemetery. The name alone caught my attention. When I asked why it was so famous, he smiled and said something I still remember. Most people who visit during the day think the stories are nonsense. Most people who visit at night stop laughing. A few days later, I decided to find out for myself. I arrived just before sunset. The cemetery wasn't large. In fact, it looked surprisingly ordinary. Old gravestones stood among the trees, and a narrow road passed nearby. Nothing about the place immediately felt frightening. If anything, it felt peaceful. I spent nearly an hour walking through the area, reading names on old markers and taking photographs. Everything seemed exactly as expected. The stories began to feel exaggerated. Then the sun started to disappear. And the atmosphere changed. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not complete silence. Just the absence of normal sounds. The birds that had been active earlier seemed to vanish. The wind became weaker. Even the nearby road felt strangely quiet. I remember checking my phone and realizing I had stayed longer than planned. Darkness was arriving quickly. I told myself I would leave after taking a few final photographs. That's when I heard the sound. A single footstep. Behind me. The noise was clear enough that I turned around instantly. Nobody was there. I looked across the cemetery. Nothing moved. The trees stood perfectly still. I waited several seconds. No second footstep followed. Eventually I convinced myself it had been a branch falling or an animal moving nearby. That explanation seemed reasonable. At least for the moment. I continued toward the exit. A few minutes later, I heard something else. This time it sounded like a faint voice. Not words. Just the distant sound of someone speaking. I stopped immediately. The cemetery was empty. The road nearby was empty. Yet for a brief moment, I was certain I had heard someone. The sound disappeared almost instantly, leaving behind an uncomfortable silence. At this point, I was ready to leave. Not because I believed anything paranormal was happening. Because the place no longer felt welcoming. As I walked toward my car, I glanced back one final time. That was when I noticed what looked like a person standing near one of the trees. A dark figure. Motionless. Watching. For a second, I assumed another visitor had arrived. Then I looked more carefully. The figure seemed oddly shaped. Almost blending into the shadows. I blinked. Looked away. Looked back again. It was gone. Completely gone. I stood there trying to make sense of what I had seen. The logical explanation was simple. Poor lighting. Shadows. A trick of perspective. I knew that. Yet my heart was racing anyway. I quickly reached my car and sat inside for several moments before starting the engine. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror. The cemetery was already disappearing into the darkness. Even now, years later, I can't honestly say I saw a ghost at Blood's Point Cemetery. I never witnessed anything impossible. I never captured evidence of anything supernatural. But I also can't forget the strange silence, the unexplained sounds, and the figure that seemed to vanish the moment I focused on it. Maybe there was a simple explanation for every part of that night. Maybe there wasn't. What I know for certain is that Blood's Point Cemetery felt completely ordinary when I arrived. And completely different when I left. 14 Riverview Cemetery. I arrived at Riverview Cemetery on a cold evening in early October. The original plan was simple. I wanted to photograph a few historic sections of the cemetery before sunset and then head back to town. Nothing more. At first, everything went exactly as expected. The cemetery was quiet. A few visitors walked between the older graves. The trees were beginning to lose their leaves, and the entire place carried the calm atmosphere that many historic cemeteries have. Honestly, I wasn't expecting anything unusual. I had visited dozens of similar locations before. Most turned out to be peaceful places filled with history. Riverview Cemetery seemed no different. For nearly an hour, I walked slowly through the grounds, reading names and dates on old gravestones. Some markers were more than a century old. Standing there, I found myself thinking about how many lives were represented in such a small area. Entire families. Generations of people. Stories that most of the world had forgotten. As the afternoon faded, the cemetery became noticeably quieter. The last few visitors left. The wind began moving through the trees. Long shadows stretched across the ground. For the first time that day, I felt completely alone. I remember stopping near one of the older sections to take a photograph. The lighting was perfect. The setting sun created a golden glow across the rows of graves. I raised my camera and took several pictures. Then I lowered it and noticed something strange. A figure stood farther ahead between two trees. At least, I thought it did. The person appeared motionless. Too far away to identify clearly. My first assumption was that another visitor had arrived. That wasn't unusual. I looked away for a second while adjusting my camera. When I looked back, the figure seemed gone. Not walking away. Gone. The area appeared empty. I stared for several moments trying to understand what had happened. Eventually I convinced myself it had simply been a trick of light. The shadows were growing longer. The human brain often mistakes shapes for people. That explanation seemed reasonable. So I continued walking. But the experience stayed in my mind. A few minutes later, I heard something behind me. The sound resembled footsteps moving through dry leaves. Slow. Steady. Close enough that I automatically assumed someone was approaching. I turned around expecting to see another visitor. Nobody was there. The path behind me remained empty. The only movement came from leaves drifting across the ground. For a moment, I simply stood there listening. The sound stopped. The silence returned. And somehow the silence felt worse. I checked the time and decided it was finally time to leave. The sun had almost disappeared. Darkness was arriving faster than I expected. As I walked toward the exit, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following at a distance. Not close enough to see. Not close enough to hear clearly. Just there. Watching. Every time I turned around, the feeling vanished. Then returned moments later. By the time I reached my car, I felt relieved. Not frightened. just relieved. I sat inside for several minutes before starting the engine. As I prepared to leave, I looked back across the cemetery one final time. Everything appeared perfectly normal. Rows of gravestones. Trees. Shadows. Nothing unusual. Nothing impossible. Even now, I don't claim that I experienced anything supernatural at Riverview Cemetery. Every strange moment could probably be explained. The figure. The footsteps. The feeling of being watched. All of it. Yet years later, I still remember that evening more clearly than many other places I've visited. Because sometimes the most unsettling experiences aren't the ones you can prove. They're the ones that leave you questioning what you thought you saw long after you've gone home. 15 Lincoln Theater. I have always loved old theaters. There is something special about walking into a building where thousands of people once gathered for the same purpose. Laughter, excitement, applause, and memories somehow seem to remain inside the walls long after the crowds disappear. That was exactly what brought me to Lincoln Theater. I had heard stories about the building for years. Most focused on its history. A few focused on stranger things. I wasn't interested in ghost stories when I arrived. I was interested in the theater itself. The architecture was beautiful. Even after all these years, the building still carried the feeling of a place that had once been important. The moment I stepped inside, I found myself looking everywhere. The stage. The balcony. The rows of seats. Everything seemed frozen in time. At first, the atmosphere felt welcoming. Comfortable. Familiar. I spent nearly an hour exploring different sections of the building and taking photographs. Nothing unusual happened. In fact, I began thinking that the stories surrounding the theater were probably exaggerated. Then evening arrived. And everything changed. The building became noticeably quieter. The sounds from outside faded away. The empty seats suddenly felt different. Not frightening. Just strange. I remember standing near the stage and looking out toward the audience area. Hundreds of empty seats stared back at me. For a moment, I imagined what the theater must have looked like during a sold-out performance decades ago. The image felt almost real. Then I heard a sound. A single seat folding upward. The noise was unmistakable. Anyone who has spent time in a theater knows the sound immediately. I turned toward the audience area. Nothing moved. Every seat appeared empty. I waited. The silence returned. Eventually I returned to exploring. But the sound stayed in my mind. A few minutes later, I climbed toward the balcony. The upper level offered a great view of the stage below. As I stood there taking photographs, I noticed something unusual. Near the far side of the theater, I thought I saw movement. A person crossing between rows of seats. The sight lasted only a second. Maybe less. I lowered my camera and looked directly toward the area. The seats were empty. Completely empty. I stared for several moments. Nothing appeared out of place. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen someone. The experience made me uncomfortable. Not because it seemed paranormal. Because I genuinely believed another person was inside the theater. And I couldn't find them. As darkness settled outside, the building felt larger than before. The shadows deepened. The empty spaces seemed wider. Even small sounds became noticeable. A distant creak. A faint thump. The kind of noises old buildings naturally make. Yet each one demanded my attention. Eventually I decided it was time to leave. As I headed toward the exit, I stopped one final time and looked back across the theater. The stage sat silent beneath the dim lighting. The audience area remained empty. Everything appeared completely normal. Then came one last moment that I still remember clearly. For just a second, I thought I heard applause. Not loud applause. Not a crowd. Just a faint burst of clapping somewhere deep inside the building. The sound vanished almost immediately, leaving only silence behind. I stood there listening. Nothing followed. A few moments later, I walked out. Even today, I cannot honestly say that anything supernatural happened inside Lincoln Theater. Old buildings create strange sounds. Light plays tricks on the eyes. The mind fills in gaps. I understand all of that. But of all the historic theaters I have visited, Lincoln Theater is the one I remember most. Because when I left that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that the performance had ended long ago. Yet somehow, part of the audience never left.